Hello from your favorite Grasslands PR team. Today we're back with another reason why these overlooked and underappreciated ecosystems are objectively the best biome. I'm Nicole.
I'm Alan.
And I'm Rachel. And today we're going to be talking about something that I think is going to be just kind of nice.
Oh.
Whoa.
And when I say that, I don't mean that I'm secretly going to talk about volcanic destruction.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
There was kind of a bait and switch last time, huh?
I mean, volcanoes are, it's just a part of life.
Everything's a part of life, but...
I don't know. Volcanoes are neutral.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, plants compete for resources.
Yes.
Or so traditional ecological wisdom tells us.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Consider the common sunflower, who is going to be our through line for this episode about plants. Which I managed to completely avoid talking about invasive species to keep it nice.
Nice.
That's nice. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. There's a study in 2019 by James F. Cahill that showed that when you have sunflowers growing with little patches of nutrients, the plants, when they're just grown by themselves, will fill up those nutrients with their roots. Makes sense. They're just like, that's all mine. And they slurp it all up.
Sure. Yeah.
That's the baseline. What about when they share that nutrient patch with a neighbor? Well, if the plants are equally spaced from the nutrient patch, it turns out that the focal plant, the one that you're like studying, they divide them into like the focal plant and the neighbor, right? The focal plant will actually put down fewer roots, sort of avoiding and thereby sharing that little patch of nutrients with its neighbor. And the position of those plants matters because if the focal plant was closer geographically, spatially, to the patch of nutrients, it would produce more roots than normal, actually filling it up more than it would when it was by itself. But if the neighbor was closer to the good patch, the focal plant would avoid that patch to avoid competing with that plant and might even put its roots further down searching for alternatives and put more effort into avoiding competing. And what about when there's two patches equally spaced? Well, they'll fill up their little patch like normal and then politely avoid the patch their neighbor is in.
Okay.
Is it politeness or still technically avoiding competition?
This is some deeply Midwestern behavior, yes.
Yeah.
This is some, I'm just going to scoop my roots down deeper there. Just going to scoop past you, sorry.
Yep. No, that's a really good question, Nicole, because I think that's kind of like at the crux of this episode, right? Because at least in this instance, it's demonstrating that the spatial, social context of neighbors matters to sunflowers. And it affects the decisions that they're making while they're foraging is the word that these researchers are using to describe this root searching behavior.
Sure.
And in some contexts, it seems like this is very much anthropomorphizing, but sunflowers are more polite than we would expect them to be. And maybe it is avoiding competition. But I think we're exposing here some of our limitations that we get from classic plant ecology. Today, I am going to be talking about how in grassland communities, plant dynamics are very complex, and there might be a lot more going on than our like traditional scientific wisdom tells us is going on. This is sort of an emerging field of study. There's not a lot of concrete data out there, but some of the data that does exist is either very specifically crop focused or very specifically grasslands focused. So we're just going to dive into some of that. I've been reading a book. I recently finished it called Light Eaters by Zoe Schlanger, which is where I first was exposed to one of these researchers who was investigating this. He goes by JC, but his name is James F. Cahill in publications. And he has a plant ecology lab in the University of Alberta. And his work was covered in this book, which is where I got first exposed to it. And I don't want to give the impression that this is just one guy doing rogue plant research, because there is a body of work that's being developed around like sort of plant behavior and community dynamics and things like that. But he specifically has been working for decades in Great Plains, like grasslands in Alberta, Canada. Sorry, I almost said my brain thought I was trying to say Kansas. Yeah.
The Great Plains of Canada. Yes.
Yeah. And so I saw that and I was like, wait a minute, he's studying like grassland community dynamics. And nowhere in the book or honestly in his body of research is this really being applied to grasslands specifically. But so much of the work is being done on grassland plants. And it gave me a lot of questions of like, what does this mean about the way that grasslands in this like highly disturbed environment are functioning? Like, what do we not understand about plant dynamics in this context? How is that different from forest plant dynamics? How does this affect how we plant native gardens? Things like that. There aren't answers to a lot of those questions, but I think it's cool to explore what we do know so that we can find the places where we do have those questions or rely on some of our like observational wisdom to make some inferences about how plants will work well together.
No, I love that. It brings to mind like the classical, grassland plants have such deep roots because they're looking for water. But like we know that different plants will just grow different depths of roots. And it's like, if they're all just looking for water, why would they not just all go as deep as possible?
Right.
And like the emerging thought behind it is actually they're trying to avoid each other. So
yeah. And that like, a lot of the researchers, not just Cahill, are talking about this in terms of like social behavior in plants. And I'll get into that a little bit because that's sort of an emerging field, even though a lot of that behavior is considered more the norm now. Like we have enough data backing up these ideas that it's sort of the norm that plants are like communicating and sensing each other and that sort of thing. But with that in mind, it's like very complicated. And traditionally, a lot of plant ecology has been very narrow focused on stuff like aggression and competition and completely overlooking other things. So let's like back up a little bit. I want to talk about like some of the limitations of our classic ecological views that we've had for a long time in at least, the United States and Western sort of scientific traditions, right? So like I said, plant behavior, communication, and in a lot of ways, agency in plants is now considered more the norm than the exception. We know, and we've known for a long time, that plants are signaling to each other. They're communicating, even like across taxa. Like there's really cool examples of plants signaling to wasp predators of their pests to like bring in wasp armies to attack aphids or, caterpillars or whatever it might be. And we also understand now that other organisms, maybe not even related taxa at all, like obviously insects, are eavesdropping on those communications. So additionally, we see that plants, when they are growing in different environments, will change the way that they're growing. It's not necessarily like, this plant happens to make deep roots, so it's going to make deep roots. Like a lot of the ways that plants grow are completely conditional to their surroundings, Yeah. There was a really cool chapter in the book where in Light Eaters where one of the researchers was trying to describe the work she's doing in her lab with her students. And she was like, I really like the inevitable realization that dawns on my grad students' faces when they understand that there is no control that would give a plant like natural growing conditions. Because it's so variable.
Interesting.
Cool.
Yeah.
Plants not only have behavior, which is like a response to a stimulus, right?
Sure.
But there are also individual differences in how they behave. So like one individual plant of a specific type might be more aggressive than others of its kind.
Wait. So you're saying that individuals of a plant. Wait, hang on. So individuals of a species will have differing behavioral traits.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
That aren't influenced by like an environmental stimulus. They just sort of behave differently.
Yeah. Like under the same conditions, one individual plant might choose a more aggressive pathway than another of the same species under the same conditions.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Cool.
So the strategies will differ between individuals too, which makes sense because that's just kind of how evolution works.
Yeah.
And Cahill has a lot to say about this topic because this is really fun. He's married to an animal behavior scientist. So he and his wife are like applying a lot of like, I don't know, cross-pollination in their research with like her studying animal behavior. And he's like, plant behavior is happening too. He has an entire publication that it's like maybe 15 years old now at this point, but it was called The Inevitability of Plant Behavior. And he says, quote, "We go out of our way to call contingent processes anything other than behavior. Adaptive plasticity, developmental instability, tropism, nastic movement, induced defenses, etc. The downside to the pursuit of semantic purity has been the tendency also to dismiss highly relevant theories and concepts developed in behavioral ecology." And so that's why plant science right now seems to be moving toward just calling it what it is.
Yeah.
Because it's just semantic purism.
Sure.
Plants behave in different conditions in different ways.
Do you think that degree of getting caught up in the semantics is because they're trying to avoid attributing something to a plant that, because the words have connotation and the words have power. So like if you start talking about plants in this certain way, do you think they're afraid of like, okay, we're afraid of the implications that would have?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Because a lot of this kind of dips elbows into work on like plant intelligence and like plant nerve responses. Not that they have nerves, but that they appear to be like sensing things around them. And it's bringing up some really uncomfortable questions that I think it's very obvious and well documented that the community of botanical scientists is very resistant to going there with these topics. And actually, he brought this up. I watched an interview that he did where he mentioned that some of the work being done is in a legal arm because he does some work with agriculture and grazing regimes and things like that. But he was like, yeah, legally speaking, his concern of the implications of some of this research is actually not that there will be new barriers or regulations surrounding plants, but rather that maybe by breaking through how normal this is, it will somehow cause an argument for reducing animal protections.
Oh.
Yeah.
If everything feels, then animals aren't special anymore.
Yeah, and it might degrade whatever barriers we have in place to sort of protect animals because we view them having behavior and feeling things as being unique.
Yeah.
And if it's like, well, if plants do too, then we might as well, I don't know, chop up dogs in our salad. That's not what I mean. But you know what I mean? It's like if you think too hard about like plants in a lot of these ways and it feels like anthropomorphizing, and popular science does a really terrible job of representing research like this.
Yeah.
It's got some really scary implications. Like, how do you reduce harm if everything that we could possibly eat is experiencing harm?
Yeah. Either you're elevating plants or you're degrading animals.
Yes, exactly. And I don't think, and Cahill doesn't think, based on a lot of the work he's doing and being around people who are more learned about this, that plants are going to end up being elevated. He just doesn't see that happening. So but that's a good question. And that's exactly why there is a lot of resistance to the words we're using. And it makes sense. But if you think about like shifting your like philosophical viewpoint to just natural selection creates behavior, it makes a lot more sense. And you really don't need a brain intelligence or like even consciousness to develop behavior. So I'm not talking about that when I say behavior.
Gotcha. speaking of behavior and like words matter and things, I'm reading Braiding Sweetgrass.
Yes. Oh my God. I have a reference to that in here.
Oh, nice. But yeah, the author goes on for quite a while in the beginning, which I really, really liked, about, a lot of indigenous languages talk about animals and plants as like living beings. They aren't its.
Mhm.
It's, this being is this being is that, not degrading it even in your language, and like how powerful that is.
Yeah.
And really fosters a deeper connection with like everything around you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that's like touching on what this episode ended up being, because originally I just wanted to talk about like community dynamics, and this ended up being very informed by the work of Cahill, obviously, and other researchers, and Zoe Schlanger's book. But it really led me to seeing that what we need is more of a paradigm shift in how we talk about ecology. And how that can be super beneficial, because clinging to like something somebody said 50 or 60 years ago must be true does not help us progress. And I think it's really exciting to look at this shift, because it could really benefit us. Like, yeah. Getting back on track here, basically, plants do have distinct behaviors. And what does plant behavior mean for ecology, plant community science, and grasslands specifically? And one of the main takeaways is that we probably have an over-reliance on this like classic idea of competition in ecology, which really overlooks the ways that plants and even fungi and microbes and other members of the community are working together to make that community function, right? We tend to focus on one antagonistic feature. Like, we've known about sunflower allelopathy forever. That's, when they're chemically attacking neighbors. And we're just now realizing that they are, in some contexts, not only happy to share, happy is, you know what I mean. Yeah. But they'll go out of their way to make sure that, that plant can have those resources. So that's very different. Sometimes interactions are deeply competitive, but not always. And we've probably just overblown that. So why is that? Why has plant ecology been so reliant on this like aggression and even like resource management? And why is that like the crux of it all? It's literally because agriculture is the origin of this Western plant science. So agricultural studies morphed and merged into plant ecology. So I'll posit to you. I'll throw you guys this question. What are some major differences in wild plant communities and cultured crops that would make this maybe not the best course of action?
Well, if you're trying to cultivate a monoculture of crops, probably you want to selectively breed them for whichever behaviors are going to outcompete whatever's already there, right? Because you don't want weeds, you don't want other things, right? You want to have this one plant like dominate a section of the landscape for utility. With the selective breeding of plants, would they end up accentuating the competitive and like the competitive aspects of the plant, I guess? Yeah,
absolutely. There's actually work showing that we may have accidentally, without even realizing it, bred hyper aggressive plants because people breeding crops assumed that like aggressive or, vigorous looking plants were the more desirable crops, which also means that we may have completely overlooked beneficial qualities that those plants would have had and accidentally bred them out of the plants without even knowing that we were doing that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So that's definitely one outcome here. Yeah.
similar behaviors, but also similar genetics. So then
Mhm.
it's reinforcing those similar behaviors that are, aggressive. So
Yeah.
it's not a diverse community that you're looking at by any means, species or
Yeah.
behavior or genetically.
Well, and it's really like post-industrial that like we started creating these massive plant monocultures, right?
Yeah, there was a period called the Green Revolution, and I honestly don't know when that was because my brain doesn't care about dates, so I didn't write it down.
That's fair.
But yeah, there was like a specific like Green Revolution where we really like popped off with mass producing agriculture
Yeah, because
in this country, at least. Yeah.
like I guess in like pre-industrial agriculture, you would have things like co-plantings be a lot more common, right? Where you would be growing multiple like a community of plants together that aren't necessarily trying to strangle each other out of the space they're in because you want to maximize your yield, right? So like
Yeah, definitely.
yeah, okay. I'm just trying to think of like when did this like shift, I guess, into
Actually, let me look up when the Green Revolution was. Oh, the Third Agricultural Revolution, a period of technology transfer initiatives that saw greatly increased crop yields. Early 20th century
okay, yeah.
is when it really started to pop off in developed countries, and then it kind of spread globally until about the 1980s.
Okay, yeah. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, okay.
Going back to the original question, it's like since agriculture studies morphed into plant ecology, and you see a lot today, and this isn't me saying that this is a bad idea or advocating that we stop caring about agriculture. That's not at all what I'm saying. But, to this day, you'll see a lot of people doing plant ecology work, trying to justify their work by pointing out how it's attributable to agriculture practices.
Sure.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah. One of the other implications of this is that a lot of plant ecology historically has been hyper fixated on nutrients and soil resources, because that's the perspective that agriculture is bringing into these spaces. And just in general, we've really overlooked a lot of the wisdom that we get from other scientific fields, like indigenous wisdom of companion planting or breakthroughs in animal behavior, as how those things could apply to plant ecology and plant sciences. And with regards to like hyper aggressive plants being bred, we may have bred out altruistic sort of traits that would actually lead these plants to producing more fruits, because when growers are looking at like the quality of crops, they're like, oh, this one's got like these big vigorous leaves and these big vigorous roots. And it's like, actually, that might be a sign of this plant putting too much work into the things that aren't the fruit that we're trying to harvest.
Yeah. It's doing too much.
Yeah, it's doing too much, which isn't always a good thing.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's kind of what newer plant science is trying to pull away from, because we're asking what things have we overlooked, because that's the main focus we've had. Yeah. And again, I don't think this has really been answered, but it really makes me wonder if there's behavioral differences in cooperation in plant communities that thrive in disturbance. Like, how do these plant neighborhoods teach us about how invasive species will work when they sweep into a new environment that maybe isn't as prone to share or whatever? Anyway, so let's go back to the sunflower to look at some other ways that plant communities can work together. Sunflowers traditionally have really been focused on the allelopathic aspects. Other grassland plants are too, like goldenrods are allelopathic. It's chemicals that are produced in the bodies of the plant that have harmful effects on other plants. In this case, it's like phenols, flavonoids, terpenoids, things like that. And we know that these chemicals can intensify allelopathy of neighbors, which is kind of cool. And in sunflowers, it can be strong enough that it suppresses weeds even. We grow sunflowers as a crop, so we have a lot of data on how sunflowers work. Yeah. And this has been a huge focus of sunflower research. But it turns out, as we just learned, sunflowers consider both the social context of their neighbors and nutrients when they're exploring and foraging with their roots. We also learn from that research that plants can anticipate future outcomes and alter their behavior in advance. So we see that some of these changes in the way that they're growing occur well before they even reach a nutrient patch and well before they've come into any contact with their neighbor. So they're able to sense the presence of these things and alter their behavior in advance, anticipating whatever outcome is giving their behaviors. Like, we can't really apply meaning to it, but, you know, it could be that it expects the neighbor to really try to monopolize that one. So it's like, whatever the reasoning is, it's anticipating something happening.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah, which is really cool. We also see this in studies with peas that show that when nutrient levels are increasing, as opposed to just being constant and high, those peas will anticipate the nutrients continuing to increase and put out more roots than if they're just high nutrient levels, because they're anticipating a future outcome, which is really cool.
Yeah.
And so this is kind of analogous to a lot of like behavior stuff we see in animals, where it's like they're considering the location of resources, the presence of their competitors, and taking all of this information into consideration. Now, taking it a step further, it turns out sunflowers also care about the identities of their neighbors. In 2017, there was a different researcher in Argentina that found that sunflower farmers could get up to 47% more oil yield from their crops if they grow them in rows of relatives. And they're surrounded by their relatives. Traditionally, sunflowers grown together were assumed to always just attack each other underground. But these guys were able to grow the flowers at completely unheard of densities, like never heard of densities like this succeeding in sunflower farming. The sunflowers tilted their stalks at alternating angles to avoid shading out their family members.
That's cool.
There was no sign that they were robbing each other of nutrients. So not only were they behaving below ground, but they were behaving above ground to be considerate of their neighbors. And this I thought was funny. If they were allowed to grow at odd angles, because often farmers force them to grow upright, which is stupid. But when they allowed the sunflowers to grow at these weird angles that they wanted to grow in, each flower received more light and oil production skyrocketed.
Dang.
Interesting. And that applies primarily when the plants are genetically related.
Yeah. Like if they are kin, they treat each other differently. And there's actually a lot of research about this with different plants. Yeah. Many of them are crops. Like there's some really cool stuff about rice where it's like if you have one strain of rice versus like a hybrid, and how will they treat like a totally different strain compared to its own strain compared to the hybrid strain. And we see huge differences in like the politeness basically of these plants, which if they're putting less of their resources toward competing, then they just grow more rice or more sunflower oil or whatever they're trying to grow.
That makes a lot more sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've definitely heard of like allelopathic trees doing similar, where they won't like attack their children and stuff like that. Like they move their roots out of the way. Like, yeah. And it's really crazy. And we also see that there's like environmental cues that will change this behavior too. Like if there's a lot of nutrients, that's a very different picture from if there's limited resources. If there are limited resources, sunflowers are more likely to, carpet bomb the soil with their allelopathic chemicals, right? They're like, nah, get out of here. Like, which can be beneficial if you're trying to keep weeds from growing in. But if you're trying to grow sunflowers and use less space and get higher yields, then these altruistic behaviors that we've completely ignored before and probably accidentally bred out of other lines of crops should be something we're paying attention to.
Yes.
Yeah, it's crazy.
No, never mind.
Go for it.
No, I was just gonna say this is reminding me of okay, the discussion This is a huge tangent. I
Please.
No. The discussion of like, okay, in like prepper communities, okay, like what, like if we're trying to ensure a healthy community and ensure survival in a collapse or catastrophe situation,
Yeah.
what should we prioritize? Should we prioritize community building and, working together, or should we prioritize guns and ammo? Like, it's like the competitive thing, right? Like protecting ourselves, defending our space at all costs. Like which one of those is going to actually ensure long-term survival and health?
Yeah. And also, just to point out, this is directly analogous to plant communities, I have to say. It really depends on who your neighbors are.
I mean, true.
That's
true.
right. Yeah.
Like if you have a good relationship with your neighbors, great. If your neighbor has like a machine gun mounted to his roof because he believes that the government's going to come after his specifically cans of corn in the basement or whatever.
Yeah.
Maybe in that case you want to put up some other defenses or
Yeah, that might be that's a good signal to maybe give that person their space.
Yeah. And but no, like that's actually exactly how plant communities work too. They're considering so many different facets of their environment and the identities of their neighbor. And a lot of this follows like sort of traditional thinking about altruistic behavior we've understood about animals for a long time, where it's like if you're a close-knit group, you're more likely to want to cooperate.
Yeah.
If you're already working together, we'll get to this in a second, but like, for example, to make showy flower displays cooperatively to get insects to come in, like maybe I want to continue that relationship in a hard time. And there are really crisis-related events that happen in a grassland ecosystem.
Sure.
And also in our modern era where we're facing climate change. Like drought affects plant communities significantly. A lot of the work they're doing has to do with that. I did not read those papers because I was afraid I would find another tangent that would warp my direction of this podcast episode. Fair. But, like all of those things play a huge part. And I'm totally getting ahead of myself, so let me.
No, you're fine.
But yeah, it's really cool to see how our traditional thinking is turning on its head. So backing up a little bit to this idea of like neighborhoods and working together, a lot of this work in plants. Sorry, I remembered another cool example about families. Sagebrushes are known to signal to each other chemically that, there's pests in the area and to warn each other. And there are studies showing that they will warn family members before warning strangers to give them an even quicker heads up on stuff. So yeah, it really does matter. Their relationships to each other.
Sure.
Anyway, so this work has shown that similarly to, companion crop planting and ideas like that, wild grassland plants do have preferred neighbors and will create distinct neighborhoods. This is something that Cahill has shown in this decades-long studies in Alberta. I really tried to find like published work that told me what the neighborhoods were, and I couldn't. But, he talks about this a lot in interviews and even was interviewed in Zoe Schlinger's book about this too. And it's something that he sees happening. There was also a researcher at the Universidad Rey Juan Carlos in Spain. His name is Ruben Torrices, and in 2018, his team published a study that found that flowers will invest more in advertising to pollinators if they're growing among their kin too. This is called the magnet effect. It's this idea that pollinators tend to be attracted to big clusters of showy floral displays.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And it takes a lot of energy to make flowers. Like Nicole's talked about this before. I think it's come up multiple times in the podcast. But basically, there's a trade-off,
Mhm.
to making flowers. If you make more big flowers, you might produce fewer seeds because you used up so much energy doing the flower thing. But in this case, it turns out that they are more than willing to invest more resources into showy flowers when they have family members around that will actually benefit from that too. He was quoted in Light Eaters as saying, quote, "The life of plants within a neighborhood, it's a social question. We should use social theory." Also, microbes and fungi are equally important members of this community. I skipped all those papers because that's too much. But Alan has literally talked to us before about like soil plugs of microbes being planted into grassland communities to try and help those plants thrive better, because that's an important piece of the puzzle too. And there are social exchanges happening with those species as well that are being totally overlooked. Like there was a study, this is crazy, with a coastal grass which tolerates salt. And they found that if they transplanted the mycorrhizal fungi from that grass, just the fungi, to a land-dwelling grass that's not tolerant of salt, just that one fungi could suddenly make that grass tolerant of salt.
Fascinating.
That's cool.
You know?
That's cool.
Like, so those things are deeply important to those dynamics.
Nice.
I have a very specific example of like community in braiding sweetgrass. She talks about some study, I don't remember what it was, where I believe that it was goldenrod and liatris, when they grow together in a prairie, both of them will bloom more aggressively and like have more blooms because, again, it's that magnet effect. And if we all put on these flowers, even though we're not related, we're not even the same species, we're all going to benefit.
Oh my God,
super
yes.
cool.
Yeah.
Yes. I have a similar example also from braiding sweetgrass about that exact thing, because it happens so often in nature. And like going back to Cahill's grasslands in Alberta, he studied these plants for decades, and he says that they form multi-species neighborhoods, which is the technical term. Like that's a scientific technical term in these papers. And to quote Zoe as she talked with him in this book, it doesn't seem like mere tolerance. They actively seek each other out. They are, Cahill says, coexisting. Coexisting is a powerful concept. It doesn't quite have a place in Darwinian schema of ruthless competition driving all changes in life. Quote, "Ecologists have decided neighbors must be antagonistic," Cahill says, but he just doesn't see it in the data. And so in these studies of these plant communities and the composition of the communities in Alberta, the composition is constantly changing. They'll have different treatments where they'll artificially induce a drought, or maybe they'll even remove a species altogether just to see what will happen, right? And if one variable changes, a different variable shifts, and suddenly there's a new species composition that forms. But regardless, the plants that are remaining don't necessarily seem to rush to colonize that vacant spot. They're not filling it in with their leaves necessarily to gorge on sunlight, or like rushing to colonize that vacant spot with their roots. It reminded me a lot of the anecdotes we've heard about the tallgrass prairie during the Dust Bowl, where that like plasticity of just having so many different plants and so much variability makes the ecosystem function almost in the same way that like genotypic plasticity helps an animal or like a species function, right? It's like if we have a lot of variation in the plants, then we can survive whatever comes. And the interesting piece here is that, well, I have a quote. I'll just read this quote again because it's a really good one. Quote, "The makeup of neighborhoods rearrange themselves, sometimes in extremely unpredictable ways, and never following ecological models for what is supposed to happen." Quote, "You don't need competition to explain this," Cahill says. The quote continues, "It doesn't mean competition isn't there, but we can explain all of our patterns without ever once talking about competition." And so thinking about community dynamics here, they are so complex, and they are not the result of traditional like dominant plant wins thinking. It also really doesn't paint like a selfish picture of like individualistic survival, which is the way we traditionally think about these types of things. Maybe that's inherited from ag, maybe it's inherited from Darwinism, but this is a community, and it functions socially as a community. And we have to look at it that way, which is really, really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a fun way of thinking about even, plants A, B, and C really like sandy soil, and so I expect them to be here, blah, 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 blah. But maybe it's not actually the sandy soil. It's like each other.
Yeah.
And that's why they're there.
Right? I was constantly thinking about how this might apply to native gardens and also restoration work, right?
Yeah.
Because like, what if we've accidentally been doing restorations wrong because we just said, well, like, what plants should be in this range, which ones are easy to get, let's put them there.
Yeah.
When actually maybe the things that make a community robust and strong are like specific relationships with plants. Like, should we be going out to fragmented grasslands that remain and look specifically at like which plants are growing together, which plants are blooming together? Should that be what makes up our native gardens or our restoration work more so than range or like the ease of access to the species? And I mean, the answer is probably yes, absolutely.
Yeah, the community dynamic. If you don't recreate that, then you might be hamstringing your ability for success, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Especially because like we barely understand what's going on, right? Obviously, like we have so little research on what those various interactions look like or what's happening. All we know now basically is it's not individualistic survival and aggression and competition. That isn't the sole piece. It's just like a tiny little blip in the mosaic of interactions that's happening.
Yeah.
I really only have one more major point before we can just wax poetic about our conclusions here, because it's a very open-ended topic, right?
Sure.
But this is from Braiding Sweetgrass. The author is Robin Kimmerer. She's a botanist and also a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. And in chapter 5, she talks about this like burning question she had as a young, not quite botanist, where she was like, why do asters and goldenrod bloom together each September? And it's like such a beautiful display. Those flowers are yellow and purple. And she's like, why are they so beautiful? Was like her idea, right? And then eventually when she got into science and like botany as a study, she decided to pursue that question, but she had to sort of use acceptable modern scientific logic because her professor was really demeaning about, the idea of questioning beauty as a scientific pursuit, right? But with modern accepted scientific logic, she was like, okay, so if there's a benefit to them growing together and they're doing it on purpose, there will be more seeds or like some measurable reproductive success benefit, right? So she decided to look at bees, and she observed that to human eyes, we respond a lot more strongly when we see yellow and purple together than we do to either color separately. And that's just like, color theory, right? That's just how that works. And she was like, what if that's also true for bees? And she studied it. And like, yes, bees are obviously, we've talked about this a lot. Bees are very sensitive to color. They're very sensitive to the spectrum of light. And that's the entire point of flowers. And the display of both these flowers together does work on bees. Together, they are attracting more of each other's pollinators than they do separately. And like you said before, this is just one example of the many ways that plants are probably working together, benefiting from each other, reasons why it would be advantageous, to use traditional words for that sort of model, to cooperate and to signal to each other that we're going to work together and bloom, to seek each other out and form neighborhoods of their preferred companions. There is science to match this. And also sometimes our instincts of like, wow, those flowers sure do look good together now that I see them out there. Maybe I should put them together in my garden is a valid way of thinking, because sometimes we're picking up on patterns. We might not understand why they work, but those patterns are there and we recognize them because we're animals too, you know?
Yeah.
Plant communities are complicated. And my conclusion from learning this is that maybe as we work to restore to plant native, and even as we seek to preserve like what grasslands do remain, we really need to understand and consider how these existing neighborhoods function. We need to consider recreating them. We need to consider even more, once again, reinforcing the importance of preserving what is still there. Because you can toss a bunch of seeds out into a former ag field and create something like a grassland. But is that going to be the same thing as those plant communities that developed from eons of working together? Absolutely not. Yeah. And so thinking of these neighborhoods and their function, not just in terms of competition and aggression, but maybe in terms of like neighborhood homeowners associations in which diversity and social considerations are key to maintaining the order that we're trying to recreate, right?
I don't know that HOAs really value diversity of
anything.
They should.
Well,
you're right. That was a really bad example.
They seem to be pretty uniform HOA neighborhoods.
Yeah,
so,
you're right.
Yeah. They're really like the human home equivalent of a monoculture.
Yeah. You're right. That is pretty bad.
The social
aspect is what I was thinking
there we go.
of.
Yeah, the socializing. Yes.
Yeah.
There.
Like you got to bring your whole neighborhood together, and like it's important to have like the lady who's going to be like, hey, this is our problem, because sometimes she might be right. It's important to have the guy who's like, can't we just leave each other all alone and you know, mind our own business, because sometimes he's right.
Yeah.
I don't know. What I'm trying to say is that
No, yeah, I'm following you. Yeah.
I'm trying to say that, there's like a social aspect to these behaviors, and we can have a lot more success in our human goals.
Yes.
And let plants have a lot more success in our ecological goals if we suck it up, put our prejudices behind us about behavior and sociality, and applying those concepts to plants. Yeah. And just look at it that way.
Yeah. I think that's that's compelling. I mean, I think it does come from like the Darwinian like struggle for existence.
Yeah.
You know, the kind of nature red in tooth and claw thing where we're like, oh, you know, I only care about myself to the exclusion of everything else. I will kill everything if I have to, as long as I get to reproduce, right?
Yeah.
Which is like, it's probably ignoring, like you said, the complexity of these dynamics between living things in the same space. We might undervalue things like altruism and cooperation in terms of survival strategies, because we've been locked into that paradigm.
There was another study which was sort of it attempted to categorize, it was from the Cahill lab, attempted to categorize facilitative and competitive responses in plants, and did like a similar neighbor experiment, and found that a not insignificant proportion of interactions between plants was facilitative. I think they picked like 8 different plants and then planted them, species of plants, and then planted them in every single combination of pairs of species they could. It was like 168 pairs or something, just to see how they responded to each other. And there was a lot of facilitative responses going on.
Yeah.
Not just competitive ones. I don't know how they categorize that. I didn't get into that part of the study, but I was like, that's so interesting.
I mean, it makes sense. We don't generally, I mean, in most ecosystems, in a lot of ecosystems, you don't see a just a single monoculture of plant emerge, right?
yeah.
You see a structural variety of plants
Yes.
Yeah.
existing, a robust community.
Yeah. And usually when we do see a monoculture occurring in nature, it's because of some sort of invasive species dynamic that has disrupted the balance, and it can be a sign that something has gone horribly wrong.
Yeah.
You know? And
Absolutely.
I also think, okay, you were talking about something that made me also think of sort of the reverse of applying human or animal behavioral sciences to plants, but also applying natural concepts to humans is prevalent. Like, that tooth and claw, my survival at the expense of everyone else. I feel like those Darwinian ideas also get so misused to justify awful acts that humanity does against each other and against nature as well.
Yeah.
And it serves us as people to correct the way that we understand nature so that we can stop justifying things that are unnatural, and so that we can have a more realistic and holistic view of what it means to be alive on a planet with other people and other species.
Yes.
Yeah.
Ooh, yeah.
There's a lot there.
There's a lot,
yeah. And we see a lot of that, like, I think on the rise right now, of this like individualistic, like, I don't care if other people suffer,
right?
Because I think this is good for my survival.
Yeah.
And we should care.
We should care.
Yeah. And in the interview that Cahill did that I watched, he made a really compelling argument for why all scientists, and not just scientists, but all people, should read books on philosophy and should look to philosophy as we're developing our viewpoints of the world.
Yes.
And that was like a huge part of why he feels so comfortable in his position, being like, we should call things what they are.
Yeah.
We should look at behaviors and call them behaviors, and foraging and call it foraging, with roots and plants and things like that. Yeah. But, like, as human beings trying to find our place in the world, we all need to better understand philosophy, and we should be applying those concepts to every field that we're in.
Yeah. No,
Humanitarian,
absolutely.
social concepts, ecological concepts. It's all related.
Yeah.
We're all alive, and we're all the products of the same thing, which is natural selection, which creates altruism and cooperation in communities as a viable means for surviving.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Really fun emerging fields of study.
Yeah.
And I look forward to seeing how this changes the way that we native garden, personally.
Yeah. I definitely have seen some more recent talk. I think maybe Heather Holm talks about native gardening and considering, again, not just does this look pretty, blah, 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 but like the community aspect of the plants and how they interact with each other. So it is on people's minds, though not everyone's. So, yeah.
Nice.
Beautiful.
Cool.
Thank you, Rachel. And thank you for listening. The Best Biome is produced through our nonprofit Grassland Groupies, dedicated to inspiring the conservation of grasslands. In the show notes, you can find our website, phone number, and social media accounts. If you enjoyed the show and want to support us, tell your friends about us and leave a review on your podcatcher of choice. We couldn't do this without your support, and we'll see you again in 1 month.
Bye.
I have a quote from Zoe Schlinger. She says, with regard to like plants communicating and like working together with a lot of animals, she says, plants can ask or demand assistance. The world they belong to appears ready to answer their call.
Whoa.
I thought that was really cool.
Fun.
Neat.